right. Welcome, Vian.
Thank you.
So happy to have you with us today.
No, I appreciate the time to get to connect and chat.
Likewise. Vian, you're a physician, a coach, and a mother of three. You shared recently that one of the key findings from your work in 2025 was that we underestimate how much pressure high functioning young people are carrying. Tell us more about your key findings and the key sources of this pressure that you are seeing with our youth.
Thank you. It's such an important question. And I'll start by saying, as a physician in OB/GYN specifically, I've been practicing medicine for more than 20 years, right? But along the way, I've noticed some really big health risks that patients face that aren't necessarily medical, but they show up as medical. They're more behavioral, actually. And so it was more the things they couldn't say, the decisions they couldn't make, the boundaries they couldn't hold. And that's really where I started to take note of these patterns. And so when you talk about the patient in front of me, a lot of times they were not patients that were in obvious crisis. They typically were actually high functioning ones. So think about the straight A student or the leader of their group, and on paper they were thriving, but in the exam room, their bodies were telling a different story, right? So stress related symptoms, anxiety that showed up physically, and then decisions about their health that really wasn't matching how much they knew. And I think the source of this pressure, especially now, is that performance pressure never turns off. When we have social media, there's no downtime, right? It's the feeds are collecting while we sleep, and we're always performing, always curating, always managing how we look. And that's one source of this. And then the other source is this invisible cost of people pleasing. And so young people tell me often that they were conditioned to people please. You grow up, you're taught to get along with everyone, don't make waves, be easygoing. And so then that translates to them is to say yes, even when they want to say no, and that cost will accumulate. And then I would say the last piece that I think feeds into this, when we talk about the key findings I've noticed over the last few years, is there's really no practice space for these hard conversations. So we look at athletes and musicians and they practice every day for their craft. And yet when we raise our kids, we want them to be the best versions of themselves, yet there is no practical place for them to practice these hard conversations, like, and show them what healthy relationships look like.
Can you share the age group of the patients that you typically deal with?
It's typically as teens, so around 13, 14, when they start to really notice physical signs of puberty, though we know emotionally and behaviorally the puberty can start several years before that, and all the way up into the late 20s. And so really focused on Gen Z, which is around that age group. Now, I would say all adults could be faced with these types of challenges, but when we think about the time in which we really are setting our patterns, this is the age group in which I really want to see if we can influence.
So this brings me to the parenting aspect. And maybe you can share with us what are some of the key recurring questions that youth are asking you today, and how can parents create home environments where youth feel safe asking those difficult questions?
You know, if you had asked me this 2 years ago, my answer would be so different because I would have been coming from this perspective as an OB/GYN in the exam room seeing patients. The last 2 years, I've actually scaled down my practice to 2 days a week where I see college students at a local university. But the other times, I'm looking for different spaces in which teens and young adults are sharing their thoughts. So whether that's, Reddit or Facebook, or finding family friends who allow for me to talk and learn more from their young adults in their lives. Hands down, the number one theme that I've heard is this normal? So it's very simple. They just want to know, is what they're feeling normal? Is what how they're interacting in their relationships, is it normal? Is it normal whatever changes their bodies going through? Is it normal for them to have these types of reactions? And they want to know that from a very like genuine, sincere place. I found they just want to know if this matters in terms of like how it affects their current space, right? And really, if you think about it, that's not the way we approach a patient when they come in to see me. I can speak for myself. We're always looking for the symptom that we can provide a solution for versus really trying to understand why is it that they're asking these questions. And then I would say that the second part to that is They want to know if it's normal, but they also don't want to make it a big deal, and they don't want people to be weird about it. So if you think about your kid asking you a question, a lot of times it's natural. I'm a mother of three. It's natural for me to maybe over worry a little bit or get concerned. They know all of that. And so to them, that kind of reaction, they don't want to be around that. So it's better for them to maybe go elsewhere to ask that question. I found that underneath all of that, they really don't want to be diagnosed. And there's definitely a needed space for our mental health colleagues, our psychiatrists and our therapists. But that space before that, that's kind of the space we're in. We're trying to create a space for that where young people just want to know if this is normal, is it okay to react this way? And truly they don't want to be labeled. And eventually they may go down a path where they need a diagnosis, but the many that I've spoken to really live in the space before that. And I think the second part of your question is around for parents. I would say a few things come to mind. I mentioned it earlier is if you do get a question, it's really important to not react to the content of the question and more taking a breath and saying, I'm just so glad you asked me. I'm just so glad you're bringing this up, because they are looking for that first reaction on your face, or that your shoulders tightening up. They are looking for that already. So you want to just be as relaxed as possible and just say, oh my God, I'm so glad you're asking me this. And the second thing is normalizing all the mess that we live in. It's our tendency to want to fix things for ourselves and for our family. But really, if we can just let our kids see that we're messy too, and sometimes we don't know all of the answers, but that we have the skill set to try to figure it out. And I think modeling the hard conversations really is something I had to learn over the last few years. As I started to hear from these teens, I started to change how I was parenting and modeling conversations and telling them that this conversation is hard, but let's figure it out together. So if you're lucky enough where your kids are going to want to pose a question, a lot of times that first reaction is their test.
And what is one conversation that you believe every parent should have with their child earlier than they usually do?
So again, 2 years ago, I would have said, make sure you get those puberty books out, like yeah, I think all of that's still important. But I do know that a lot of parents struggle with that because, our sexual health is already uncomfortable in general for many, many cultures, for many different reasons, how we were even raised. And so us as a healthcare professional saying, hey, you need to make sure you're bringing out the puberty books at age 9, 10, 11. I still think all of that is true. Now, but I recognize a lot of it doesn't happen because it's so uncomfortable. And so I think a more comfortable conversation is starting around that 9, 10, 11-year-old age, around how do you bring up something that's uncomfortable? It's not realistic to expect for every topic for them to come in and sit you down and talk to you about it. So is there another way that you can create a space in your family that works? Maybe it's post-its dropped into a box that, no one really knows who's written it, or there are probably different ways that you could go about it. It could be an index card of different questions. And sometimes it's just pulling the question out and reading it as a family, so that certain things will surface. But I think the more you practice having uncomfortable conversations, the more likely you will learn about the uncomfortable situations that your children face.
Do you believe, beyond the educational component that you just shared, around 9, 10, 11, what are some key questions that you think are important for the parents to ask their children when it comes to their emotional and sexual health and well-being?
Mhm. I do think it's important to think about phrasing the question around not a specific topic, because it all will end up being related. So I'll give an example. I think most of us will tend to say, hey, if you ever have any questions about sex, or, you hear something at school about condoms or drugs, make sure you talk to us. And they'll say, yeah, yeah, of course, right? I think that approach is pretty difficult. And most likely you will never get that situation to actually happen. Something that I've tried personally is, hey, have you seen something today at school or on social media that you have questions about? And that could open it up to include something around sex, peer pressure, drugs, vaping, which apparently is in every middle school bathroom across the country. So kind of opening it up in that way where it's more general, but over time, it's almost inevitable for some of the other more sensitive topics to surface. right? Or like, have you seen something today that made you uncomfortable? Have you seen something today that you think is just not right? I find that approach tends to make it easier for them to open up.
In past work that you've shared online, you often say that life skills and the life skills that we're just talking about here now are actually health skills. What do you believe are the most important life skills that influence mental and physical health?
Gosh, there's so many, but in the time that I've been talking to young people, they've helped me shape it into five categories. So we really focus on emotional resilience, assertive communication, decision making skills, identity and value clarity, and self efficacy. So we chose those five because we can tie those back to validated psychological instruments that the research community has already used to study these skills. So we're not trying to be the research arm of that piece. But what we are trying to prove is, can you measure and move these skills through the kind of experiences that we've built to share with the young people? And sometimes I think we, for sure, the healthcare community, we really focused on providing education, but we've confused information with skill. And so these teens and young adults, they have the information now at their fingertips. So forget not having equity around sex ed across the country, depending on what state you live in. I mean, that is a problem that have been, no one's really figured that out for centuries. But really, the reality is they can go look it up now. So maybe we shouldn't focus so much on whether sex ed needs to be in a school class. We should probably be more focused on where are they learning the skills to do anything with that information in the first place. So what's really the point of teaching our young women, for example, all the options for contraception if at the end of the day they haven't learned how to say no to a boyfriend or girlfriend that they don't want to lose? So that's where I started to see that it's completely inseparable, these skills that there's a huge gap for our young adults. And we wonder why all of this education is not helping them make better decisions. Well, I think this is the gap that we're talking about.
Yeah, I fully agree. Are you able to potentially share one specific tip for each one of the key life skills that you just shared?
Yeah, let me think about. So the way we designed I'm calling it the curriculum, but really on the app, they don't know it's a curriculum, right? So we're trying to hide everything. So for example, for assertive communication, when we identify that as a pattern for a user who's having challenges saying yes to things that they want to say no to, some of the life skills tools that we surface is one that's very popular is 5 ways to say no. And so there are different ways to say no. And I think most of us think it's either, we have to say no directly, which is an option, but we worry about hurting someone's feelings. But there's also a way to say no where it's comical. You can make a joke out of it. Or there's a way to say no where you provide an alternative. So some of the common, it's surprising, but like a spectrum of examples I've had over the years. One is as simple as, I keep letting my friend borrow my calculator, even though I need it for school. And so then I'm stuck without a calculator all day. So one that particular user really liked was telling her friend, hey, I actually need my calculator today, but why don't we go ask the teacher if they have an extra one? And she loved that. She was like, I can totally do that. But before that, as an option, she just kept thinking, if I say no, my friend is just not going to like me anymore. And that was too big of a risk for her. So she would rather suffer and not have the calculator all day. And so that is one example, but you can imagine it goes to the other spectrum of not being able to say no when your partner doesn't want to use a condom and you know that you do not want to get pregnant, right? And so in that case, do you be firm or do you choose an alternative? So there are alternatives, things that they could use as well. So the assertive communication one, we focus on a lot because that really does bubble up to the top. When we talk about decision-making pressure, we teach them to be able to see flags of pressure. I think the obvious ones they can name, like if someone's pressuring you to do something, but they are not so aware of the manipulation. I thought you were my friend. The different ways that people can phrase things to make you feel guilty. Oh, but I got you that ice cream last week. Well, why wouldn't you go skip class with me? And so being able to surface these types of different views has been really helpful for many of them to see. And so then we do exercises where they can try to label the red flags. And it just, they find it very empowering to be able to name something. And that leads into the emotional resilience, which is as simple as naming what you're feeling. So if I give them, Brene Brown talks about 86 words that describe your emotion, like I share that with them, and they're just surprised that, instead of just saying I'm sad, it's also I'm lonely or I'm guilty, I'm scared, right? And then in terms of identity and values, one of the exercises that they really love is, 3 years from now, when you look back, what will you be the most proud of? And just showing them that when you have these values that you can identify and hold on to, it really helps shape like the choices you make. And so if you imagine your future self, like how does that empower you to help identify that? And then for self-efficacy, I think that definitely is our most challenging one, especially in this particular modern day age where, I feel like this young generation, they never feel like they can do it on their own. And they really lack this empowerment that if you're resourceful, you can figure things out. And if you know how to ask for help, you can figure things out. And so even just giving them a technique on how to ask for help it has been very rewarding.
Vian, you have built a new platform based on short micro lessons to help youth build these life skills that you have just shared with us. What small changes can people make today to build healthier relationships with themselves and also with others?
As you kind of design and develop anything, it transforms and it iterates so much. And over the past 2 years, the idea of micro lessons has been packaged in a little bit of a different way. So when I first started testing this, we had the short video clips, the bite-sized lessons, which still we do today. It's just in a different appearance, right? Because we learned pretty quickly that even though they're short, they still felt very much like a lesson, right? And so you could only really push and pull a small community. But once they kind of sensed that it was a lesson, there was a disengagement. And so what we did over the past year is we transformed it. So we took these concepts and this idea of just very short lessons and embedded it into a simulated social media feed. And that's the way our app looks today. So something that feels like Instagram or LinkedIn for our young professionals, right? But underneath it, we're observing how they respond to social pressure. Which posts do they linger on? Which poll answers do they pick? What do they say in the comments? And then it reflects it back to them. And so this insight comes from their own behavior, not necessarily the content that we're delivering, which is what we're trying to pull away from. But that they taught us that, right? So to answer your question around what can people do today to practice it, they don't necessarily need the app, right? The app is there to help support this learning. But young adults and teens, if they really just start noticing their day to day, like when was the last time, when was the next time that they say yes, but they really wanted to say no, right? This awareness is so important. Now, the app helps facilitate that, but that doesn't mean that you have to have the app to do that, right? And then paying attention to like your honesty. When was the last time you held back just a little bit, even because you didn't want something to happen? But that something we teach them is a story that we have, and sometimes those stories are mostly untrue. And giving them the tools and courage to test those stories so that they can really explore what it's like to live and have honest conversations, right? So really, I think those are the themes that the app tried to highlight and facilitate, but it's certainly something that we can all do today.
I was curious if you have seen in the recent year, let's just say, a shift in how youth are living and thriving linked to the reality beyond social media. If we simply look at AI and the impact that we see it has on societies, on organizations, and this reality that we often see in the news that it's often going to be taking away jobs and so on. Are you seeing a shift in the use as a result of the increased adoption of AI in our society?
Yes, there's so many things to speak about on that. I'll kind of focus on two. I mean, on the macro level, I do hear from the users, of course, around this fear of losing job security, and they're in college right now, or they're in grad school. They've invested so much time and money into something that they feel might not exist by the time they graduate. And so that is a common theme really across all age groups, but specifically though the young adults, because that's where they're in the education for, right? And so if anything, that highlights the importance of emotional resilience, of self-efficacy, of communication, decision making, because how else can they feel empowered to figure this out while the world is also trying to figure it out? And so it's hard to watch when most of these young adults don't have those skills already. And now there's an urgency for them to learn those skills, and they want to. The young adults that I've come across, they really want to not be on their phones all the time. They want to have the ability to speak in real conversations with people across from them. And so I think there's a stereotype, even when I first started, that maybe this generation doesn't care. And maybe the way they grew up in the digital world with the new smartphones when they were 8, 9, 10 has caused them to be disenchanted. And while that may be true for a certain population, I've just been lucky enough to come across the opposite of that, which is really what fuels my work. Like otherwise, it would be very hard to stay focused on this. Is I hear from them. They want to feel better and do better, and they want to survive whatever's going on with AI. And so that's like on a system level. I would say on a more micro level, like day to day, I talk to the college students all the time. I ask them, how do you use ChatGPT? How do you use Claude? And it's not that it's bad, but I tell them and encourage them that there's no clinician behind there. So if they want to ask health questions to guide them for the questions that they might ask in real life, I think that's fine. But the component that we've made sure to build into our platform, of course, utilizes AI, but we've coded it to make sure that the content we already know is just less than half the problem. Other side of the coin is all the life skills. And so we've made sure that our AI agent is always sharing what life skills we believe is really important for the question and topics that they've asked. And we make sure that as we gather behavioral data from the other features of the app, that we're always keeping in mind how can we help this particular user live a healthier life off of, of their phones.
Beautiful. And I want to talk about joy. If there would be a recipe for living more joyfully at any age, what would be the three main ingredients based on your overall life experience to date?
Well, I'm a huge fan of Tony Robbins and the likes, like-minded folks that we have who speak about the importance and the art and science of happiness. And I've just been fortunate enough to have lived through, what it feels like when you understand the art and science of happiness. And I want to be able to share that. So when I work with young adults and teens, I try to encourage them that this performance lifestyle that unfortunately that they've grown up to be accustomed to is the furthest that they'll be away from true joy. And that these skills, as annoying or cringy as they may be sometimes, is a way for them to get to that place where joy lives. It has to be honesty over harmony. You have to be able to say no when you really don't want to do something, or that immediately steals your joy. It immediately drains your energy, right? They have to learn and be comfortable with their own voice. That's the beauty of humanity amidst this AI world, is our own voice. And so they should honor that, and they should just show so much appreciation to the fact that they have a voice to share. And then all of that really is built on this foundation of self-recognition. Like, what's going on? Like, why am I feeling the way I am? Why do I make the decisions I do? And again, that's where the app was born, is can we help track behavior patterns and reflect it back to the user so that they can be aware, and at the end, their choice to do something about it. But first, where is that awareness? Where do they have a chance right now in their teen years and young adult years to have anything reflected back to them so that they can find their joy?
I absolutely love your work because at the end of the day, you are spreading joy through this younger generation that is growing, evolving, and dealing with so many shifts. And at the same time, when you're looking at the biological factor that their brains actually are still growing and evolving during those challenging years, I just find it beautiful that you're empowering them with the skills that they need to really thrive and live more joyfully. Can you share anything about any sort of concepts or insights into brain science or neuroscience that have been integrated into your work and your application?
Well, I think you mentioned one of them, which they love when they hear that our plasticity, is capable of changing all the way potentially up into our late 20s, at least, 25, 26. And they love that because where else would they read something like that? And I think once they hear that, they feel like maybe there's a chance for them to change whatever habits that they've seen or picked up on social media. And we talk a lot about mindset, and the filter in which you see your life is so important. The people that are around you, the five people, that you spend the most time with, are most likely the ones that influence in who you become. And just being able to have a space to share these things in a way that doesn't seem so much like a lesson is really what I think is powerful about this approach. And they just feel like more empowered to see the social impact and then know underlying that there is science behind it, or your brain is what is giving you the capability of changing your mindset, right? Like if you have a fixed mindset and now you're starting to see like patterns of a growth mindset where there's potential and possibility, that's because of the things that they're doing, and that they know that as a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old, that can still happen for them. I think that's the beauty of it, is being able to hide some of the science actually, so that they focus more on the social impact that impacts their day to day, but we know underneath that what's happening.
Yeah, and if you could give a challenge for this week to those listening to our conversation today, what challenge would you give to the youth? And what challenge would you give to those who are parents of teenagers and young adults?
Yeah. So, one of the things I do have them do is track their real yeses and their fake yeses. And we try to frame that as like regret free days, right? So, was there a moment today where you said something you actually meant or didn't mean? And we just try to make it fun and see, like, oh, this week I had, 5 fake yeses. And the week before I had 15 fake yeses, right? So that's, a fun challenge that you can do. You don't need an app for it. You literally just like are counting, what the next conversation brings for you. And that, for parents, I would say this to me is kind of fun, is encouraging a situation where you let your kids say no. And it could be very small. It could be something bigger, but let them have that discomfort in your own home so that you can guide them rather than letting it be somewhere else. And, when they're alone, I think it could be as saying no to a play date that you really don't want to go to, setting a boundary with a friend, just anything. Find some situation that maybe does not have a huge impact or consequence, and encourage them to say no. I think that's a really important thing to do for parents and their kids.
Vian, thank you so much for all the wisdom you have shared and for the positive impact that you're making on our youth.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the chance to just share this work, and hope that it's helpful for someone out there, one listener even. That would be amazing.